Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel for a brand new mystery with Molly. If you are new around here, if you have never seen my face on your screen before, then hi, my name is Molly and I post true crime videos like this every single week. So if you think that is something that you might want to stick around for, then please feel free to subscribe. And whilst you're at it, why not switch on the little notification bell so that YouTube will let you know whenever I post a new video. This week we are going to be talking about the solved case of an American serial killer who over the years has been given many nicknames. He's been dubbed the East Side Killer, the Bellevue Killer, the Charmer serial killer. In the early 90s, 3 young women were found brutally murdered in Washington, and the police believed that it was the work of a serial killer. And they knew that they had to identify and apprehend him fast because it was clear that this was a murderer who was not going to stop until he was caught. And eventually they did find him. They found him just as it's believed he was trying to claim his next victim. But quickly before we get into the case, I would like to say a huge thank you to Established Titles for kindly sponsoring this section of the video. Now, if you have never heard of Established Titles before, let me tell you a little bit more about them. So their service is based on a historic Scottish custom where those who own a section of land are referred to as lairds, or in English, lords or ladies. And Established Titles allows you to purchase as little as 1 square foot of land on a private estate in Scotland, which means that you can officially refer to yourself as a lord or a lady. And after this, you can have your title put on things like credit cards and plane tickets, your dating profile. Once you've purchased your dedicated land, Established Titles will send you your very own certificate with a crest and a unique plot number. And using this plot number, you can actually see the exact location of your land. They offer both lordship and ladyship title packs, as well as couple title packs, so that both you and your other half can have official titles with your adjoining plots of land. How adorable would that be as a present, actually? Why not surprise your partner for their birthday or your anniversary by making them a lord or a lady? But fear not, if, like myself, you do not have a significant other, you can actually get these titles for your pet. So I made my dog a lord. Of course I did. My dog Red is officially a landowner and he now has the title of a lord. Established Titles would make an incredible last minute gift for a friend or a family member. I know that I would be so excited if someone did something like this for me. And what's extra amazing about Established Titles is that for every single order, they plant a tree to support global reforestation efforts. They work closely with 2 global charities, One Tree Planted and Trees for the Future. So if you would like to check out Established Titles, then now is the time to do it, because they are currently running a massive Labor Day sale. And if you use my code, which is mollie10, you get an additional 10% off. Just go to establishedtitles.com/mollie10 to get your gifts now. And actually, Established Titles have informed me that the first 200 people to purchase a title pack through my link will have land very close to my plot, within literally a few minutes of walking distance, which is so cool. We'll all be next to each other. Once again, thank you so much to Established Titles for sponsoring this video and supporting the channel. Thank you as always to you guys for supporting the sponsors on this channel. And now let's just get into the case. So for this week's case, we are going back more than 3 decades now to the summer of 1990 in Bellevue, which is a city located on the east side of King County in the state of Washington in the US. It was the morning of the 23rd of June 1990 when employees at a McDonald's restaurant in Bellevue arrived at work and they began getting the place ready for customers who would be coming in for their breakfast. As part of their early morning shifts, they would obviously have to take out the rubbish from the previous night, and so one of the workers proceeded to do this. He grabbed the trash bags and he went out the back to the garbage bin, and as he approached the garbage bins, he was stunned to discover on the ground next to them the body of a young woman, the dead body of a young woman. So immediately this worker ran inside and the police were called straight to the scene. The woman was found lying on her back. She was completely naked. She had no clothes on. I think the only thing that she was wearing was a necklace, and it was obvious to the detectives that she had been murdered, even though they were unable to tell just from looking at her exactly how she had died. She didn't really appear to have any obvious injuries that would indicate exactly what caused her to pass away. So for example, they didn't see any like deep stab wounds or anything, no gunshot wounds. It was the way that her body had been left which strongly made detectives believe that she was the victim of a homicide. As I said, she was found nude and it looked as though someone had posed her body. Detectives noticed that her legs and her feet had been positioned in a specific way. Her legs were kind of crossed over. Her hands had also been placed on her stomach, and in her hands she was holding a pine cone. It almost appeared as though someone had positioned her to make it look like she was in a coffin. Her feet were crossed over, her hands on her stomach. However, there was also a coffee cup lid covering one of her eyes, her right eye, and I'm not entirely sure what the significance of that was, but all of this indicated that foul play was involved in this woman's death, and whoever did this to her posed her body in this way, I guess maybe for shock value. Detectives didn't find any signs of a struggle at the scene by the garbage bins, so it didn't seem as though this was the place where she had died. She had clearly been killed elsewhere and then her body was transported to this location. This was the killer's dumping site, which I think already says a lot about this killer, how the perpetrator viewed this woman. To dump her body next to some garbage bins just shows how he feels about her, how little respect and dignity he wanted to give her. He left her naked body there like she was trash. It's awful. So upon the discovery of this body, the investigation into this woman's death immediately began, and the police's first task was to figure out who this woman was. Although this did prove to be difficult for them, there was nothing on her body or at the scene that could have told them her name. She had no ID on her. She obviously wasn't wearing any clothes, so it wasn't like they could try to identify her through her clothing. So they were stumped. They had no idea who she was. And though her post-mortem also didn't tell them her name, it of course did provide the police with some more insight into her death. Shortly after her body was found, she was taken to the medical examiner's office, and it was concluded that she hadn't actually been dead for very long before she was found by that McDonald's employee. She had only been killed about 5 hours earlier, so she was killed probably somewhere between late in the evening on the 22nd of June to the early hours of the morning on the 23rd. It was also determined in her autopsy that this woman had been strangled with some kind of ligature. That was her cause of death, strangulation, but she also sustained even more very severe injuries. She had been hit in the head with something. She had a very severe blow to the head, and she had also been kicked in the abdomen. In fact, she had been kicked with so much force that it caused her liver to rupture. However, this killer did not stop. Even after this woman was dead, he continued to beat her, and he committed necrophilia. He raped this woman with some kind of blunt object after she had already passed away. So clearly this crime was sexually motivated, and scientists were able to detect traces of semen from the body. Although, to be honest, back then in 1990, they obviously didn't have DNA databases, so this kind of evidence wouldn't really prove too useful at the time, unless they can actually find someone that they want to test it against. But swabs and samples were collected from the body, fibers were collected, and the task of trying to identify this poor woman continued. But as I said, it was a struggle. The police were checking missing persons reports that had been made recently, trying to determine whether any of them matched the description of the victim, but that didn't really seem to get them anywhere. They checked to see if her fingerprints were on file, but nothing. They just did not not know who she was, but as you can imagine, a case as horrific as this really did grab the attention of the public. This murder was quickly all over the news, and just 4 days after the woman was found, the police had a lead when a woman reported to the authorities that her roommate was missing. She hadn't seen or heard from her in a good few days. So the police spoke to this woman that made the report, and they showed her a picture of the necklace that the murder victim was wearing, and instantly she said, "That's my roommate's necklace." Her roommate was Mary Ann Polreich. So Mary Ann was obviously the woman that had been found dead just days earlier. So just for a bit of background information on Mary Ann, she was in her late 20s at the time of her death. She was born in December of 1962, and she had a job working at a medical device manufacturing company in Bellevue. Mary Ann came from a very big family. She was actually one of 8 children, and she was very close to her family. She used to go and see her parents every single weekend, and she was described as just being a very sweet and outgoing and bubbly young woman. She was described as being like a social butterfly who really enjoyed going out at night, going to different nightclubs in Bellevue. In fact, it was eventually determined that that is what she had been doing on the night that she was murdered. She went to one of her favourite clubs or bars in Bellevue, a place called Papagayo's. Because she was a regular, the workers at Papagayo's knew Mary Ann, they recognised her, and they informed the police that she was in the bar on the evening of the 22nd of June, the night before she was found dead. It turns out actually that Mary Ann's car had just been left in the Papagayo's parking lot. It had been there since the night that she disappeared, and it hadn't moved. So this led the police to theorise that maybe she left the bar that night with the man that would go on to kill her. Although many people believed that she wouldn't have left willingly with a stranger. She was not the type to just go off with someone that she didn't know. So this suggests that perhaps either she knew her killer, or maybe she was taken with force. Something that could support this theory that she was taken against her will was that as well as leaving her car behind, Mary Ann also left her sweater and her purse at Papagayo's. She hadn't taken them with her, so that could indicate that she was maybe rushed out of the bar, causing her belongings to be left behind. So the police began taking statements from the people who worked at the bar, customers that had been in there, trying to determine whether anyone saw Mary Ann leaving Papagayo's that night, and if she did, was she with anyone? And whilst many people did mention having seen her at some point that night in Papagayo's, it appeared as though no one actually saw her leave, so no one could really comment on whether or not she left with someone else. So this was kind of a dead end for the police, and though the investigation continued, they were really struggling to work out who did this to Mary Ann Polreich. And then less than 2 months after Mary Ann was killed, it seemed as though the Bellevue Police Department had another very similar crime on their hands. On the morning of the 9th of August 1990, emergency services were called to a home in Bellevue, which was actually located just a couple of miles away from where Mary Ann's body was found. Anyway, they were called to this home because that morning the dead body of a woman had been discovered in one of the bedrooms in this house. The deceased woman was named Carol Beef. She was 35 years old. She was born in October of 1954. She worked as a bartender at some of the clubs in Bellevue. She enjoyed travelling and outdoor activities. She was hardworking, and she was a mother of 2. She and her ex-husband Paul had 2 children together, 2 daughters, Kelly and Jamie, who were just 13 and 9 when their mum passed away. And actually it was the older of the 2 girls, 13-year-old Kelly, who actually found Carol's body. She found her own mother dead. On the morning of the 9th of August, Kelly woke up and she realised that her mother's car was still parked outside of the house, which was odd because by this time her mum Carol normally would have left for work. So Kelly went to her mum's bedroom, she knocked on the door and there was no answer, and when she tried to open it, she realised that the door was locked, which again was odd. So I think it was following this when Kelly went outside, because from what I can gather, Carol had a sliding glass door in her room which led to outside of the house or the garden or something. So Kelly went around to that door, and it was then when she discovered the dead body of her mum. And this was a truly horrifying scene. The position that her body was in made it clear to the police when they arrived at the scene that Carol Beef had not just died of natural causes, she too had been murdered. Carol was found lying in a perpendicular position on her bed. She was completely naked apart from some red high heels that had been put on her feet, and she had been posed. Her legs and feet were actually bent so that the heels of her shoes were touching each other. But the most shocking thing about this crime scene, actually one of the most shocking and disturbing things that I've ever heard in a true crime case. This is very graphic, by the way, so just a pre-warning in case you want to skip ahead a few seconds. But there was actually a gun, a rifle, inserted into Carol's vagina. That is how the killer left Carol's body. So just like with Marianne, this was done for shock value. He wanted to leave his victim in a way that would stun and probably traumatize the person that found them. And as we know, the person that found Carol was her 13-year-old daughter Kelly, which is just harrowing. I honestly cannot even begin to comprehend just how distressing it must have been for Kelly to find her mum in that way. Now, despite the fact that the killer had used a rifle to assault Carol, she didn't actually have any gunshot wounds to her body. When she was found, there was a pillow over her face, and when the police removed it, they discovered that Carol had several injuries to her head. She had clearly been beaten around the head, and these injuries were so severe that her skull was crushed, and there was blood all over her bedsheet. In her autopsy, it was confirmed that this was Carol's cause of death. The killer had used some kind of heavy, blunt object to hit her around the head approximately 60 times. So I imagine that Carol would have been dead or at least unconscious after the first few blows, and yet the killer did not stop. He just kept going and going and going. There was clearly a lot of anger in this killing. So as part of the investigation into the murder of Carol Beef, the police obviously began taking statements from everyone in her life, everyone that knew her, including, of course, her 13-year-old daughter Kelly. The police obviously wanted to talk to Kelly at length because she was the one who found her mum, and it appeared as though Carol had been attacked and murdered at some point in the night on the 8th/9th of August, and her daughters were in the house that night. So the police wanted to find out if they had any information, if they had seen or heard something that night that could have been relevant to the case. And Kelly did. Kelly actually informed the police that in the early hours of the morning, she saw a man in the house. Kelly said that she was lying in her bed in her room when sometime around 4:30 a.m. she heard the sound of someone walking down the corridor, the hallway towards her room. So she closed her eyes and she pretended to be asleep, but I think she kind of kept opening her eyes just slightly to see who it was, and her bedroom door was open at the time. And walking down the hallway, Kelly just saw a figure, what looked like a male figure holding a torch or a flashlight. And as this male figure approached Kelly's door frame, he actually shone his torch into her room for a few seconds before he turned it away and he carried on walking down the hall. All the while, Kelly is still pretending to be asleep. Now, at the time, Kelly didn't actually think that this was anything sinister. Obviously, she was just 13 years old, and she actually assumed that the male figure was her mum Carol's boyfriend. She assumed that her mum had invited him over and he was just headed to her room. So Kelly didn't really think much of it and she went back to sleep. And from what I can gather, she didn't mention hearing anything else after that. She didn't hear the attack on her mum happening or any screams or anything. Maybe she was just a very deep sleeper, or maybe Carol herself was sleeping when the attack started, so she didn't even really have a chance to shout and scream very much. So it was after the police received this information from Kelly when their attention turned to Carol's boyfriend. His name was Mike. Kelly assumed that the male figure in the house was him, so the police obviously had to look into the theory that maybe he was the killer. Maybe he brutally beat his own girlfriend to death. So Mike was questioned by the police. He was asked questions about his relationship with Carol, and he actually said that they didn't always get on very well. He said that they were prone to arguments, they often disagreed on things. So I imagine the police were probably thinking, is that a possible motive? Maybe when Mike came to the house that night, he and Carol had an argument, and this argument ended with him murdering her. The police outright asked Mike if he had anything to do with his girlfriend's murder, and he said no. Although his actual words were, "I couldn't have," which apparently really stood out to the detectives. He didn't say, "I didn't do it," he just said, "I couldn't have done it." But anyway, the questioning continued, and there was something else that Mike said that added to the police's suspicion. He actually mentioned that he often went to the Papagayo's bar in Bellevue. Now, if you remember, Papagayo's was the bar that Mary Ann Polreich went to on the night that she was killed. And after Carol's body was found, the police had begun to question whether her murder could have been linked to Mary Ann's murder, whether they could have been committed by the same person, because they were very similar. Yes, they had been killed in different ways. Obviously, Mary Ann was strangled to death, whereas Carol had been beaten to death. They both had different causes of death, but the way that the killer left their bodies was just so similar. Both victims had been posed, and also, as we know in both cases, the killer just kept going with the attack. He kept inflicting injuries on their bodies even after they were already dead. And obviously, other similarities were that they happened just a couple of miles away from each other, and Carol was murdered just weeks after Mary Ann. So the police did strongly suspect that they may have been connected. And here was Mike, Carol's boyfriend, pretty much the top suspect in her murder, saying that he often went to the same bar that Mary Ann Polreich disappeared from. Perhaps if he was Carol's killer, Mary Ann was actually his first victim. So the police continued questioning Mike, and they also asked him if he wouldn't mind providing his DNA, which in fairness he did. He was more than willing to do that. So they took some samples from him, and then they actually released him because despite their suspicions, they had no evidence to prove that he was the killer, so they couldn't hold him for long. But they were going to keep looking into him as a potential suspect. And then just 3 weeks into the investigation into the murder of Carol Beath, the body of a third young woman was found. On the 31st of August 1990, emergency services were called to the home of a 24-year-old woman named Andrea Levine. She lived in Kirkland in Washington, which is only about 5 miles away from Bellevue. Andrea Levine, who was mainly called Randy by her friends and family, worked as a communications assistant. She was born in 1966. Her parents were called Doria and Leslie Levine, and Randy had 2 brothers. Their names were Stuart and Douglas. And I have a quote here from Douglas in which he is describing his sister, and he said, "She was a good person. She just wanted to live, laugh and love and just grow old like everyone else wants to." However, Randy Levine never got the chance to grow old. Her life, her future was cruelly snatched away from her. On the 31st of August 1990, Randy was found dead. Her body was discovered in her home by her landlady. So the landlady immediately called 911. When the police arrived at the scene, they found Randy on her back. She was lying on her back. She was covered in blood, and this blood had come from the numerous stab wounds that she had sustained. She had approximately 238 stab and puncture wounds all over her body. I think most of which were actually inflicted after her death. So it's all sounding very, very familiar, isn't it? Even after Randy's death, her her killer wanted to keep going. He wanted to continue inflicting injuries on her body. She'd also been beaten around the head very severely. This was actually her official cause of death, and just like the previous victims that we've talked about, Randy had also been posed by her attacker. In one of her hands, Randy was holding a book called The Joy of Sex. It had obviously been placed there by the killer, but as well as that, the killer had also forced an item down Randy's throat, and according to some sources, this item was a sex toy. And there was actually something missing from Randy's body and from her home. The police eventually determined that this ring, this gold ring with an amethyst stone that Randy wore all the time, was gone. Randy was given the ring by a good friend of hers and she loved it, so she very, very rarely took it off. But as I said, when her body was found, the ring had vanished. It seemed as though her killer had stolen it from her. Maybe he took it because he wanted it to keep as some kind of trophy so that he could always be reminded of what he did to Randy. So once again, the police thought that Randy's case was probably linked to the others. She had probably been murdered by the same man that murdered Mary Ann Polreich and Carol Beef. The police knew by this point that they were probably looking for a serial killer. After looking a little bit more into Randy and speaking to those that knew her, the detectives learned that she, similar to Mary Ann and Carol, also enjoyed going out on an evening to various different nightclubs in Bellevue. In fact, it was discovered that that is what she had been doing the night before her body was found. She had been out at a club in Bellevue. So maybe she met her killer at the club and she invited him back to her home where he murdered her. Or maybe he followed her home from the club and she had absolutely no idea. It was following the murder of Randy Levine when a special task force was set up to investigate all three murders and determine whether or not they were actually connected to each other. And as part of the investigation, scientists were carrying out forensic tests on items and potential evidence that had been collected from each crime scene. It turns out actually that at both the Carol Beef and Randy Levine crime scenes, authorities discovered a couple of hairs that hadn't come from them, so they'd probably come from the killer. According to just one source, there was a hair, just one strand of hair discovered at the Mary Ann Polreich crime scene. However, it wasn't actually found on her body, it was just found near her body. And remember, unlike Carol and Randy, who were killed and found dead in their homes, Mary Ann was found just dumped behind that McDonald's restaurant by the garbage bin. She was found outside, and that's not the place where she was murdered. So they didn't really know whether or not this hair had any relevance to her murder. They didn't know if it was the killer's hair. But as I said, I only learned that information from one source, so I don't know how accurate that is, and I don't know if they ever compared this hair to the hair that was found, or the hairs that were found at the Carol Beef and Randy Levine scenes. But anyway, they did definitely find hairs at the Carol Beef and Randy Levine scenes, which they strongly believed had come from the murderer. So the first thing they wanted to do was compare these hairs to Carol's boyfriend Mike's hair to see if it matched. And after tests were conducted, it was concluded that they were in fact not a match. And Mike's DNA was not a match to the semen found on Mary Ann Polreich's body. So he was not the killer. Mike was innocent. And he was like the top suspect in the case for a while. So I think it did kind of shock the police quite a bit when he was officially ruled out. But they just had to keep moving. They had to keep working on trying to identify other possible people of interest. And around 2 weeks after the murder of Randy Levine, an attempted break-in in Bellevue ultimately did lead to the police identifying another potential suspect. On the evening of the 12th of September 1990, a young woman named Robin Oldenburg was in her home. She lived within an apartment complex in Bellevue, and she was packing a bag because she was due to be staying at a friend's house that night. So she was doing that, she was packing her bag, when all of a sudden there was a loud knock on her window. And this knock immediately spooked Robin, because everyone in Bellevue and surrounding areas knew what had been happening. They knew that 3 bodies had been found. The police were hunting a serial killer who by this point had been dubbed the East Side killer by the media, because obviously the murders were happening in and around Bellevue, which is on the east side of King County in Washington. Everyone was talking about these murders. It was all over the news, in the papers, and people were terrified. Robin was terrified. As soon as she heard that knock, she just had this instant fear because of what had happened to Marianne, Carol, and Randy. She didn't go to the window when she heard the knock. She just ignored it, and although she was really scared, she just kept telling herself in her head, oh, it's nothing, you're being paranoid. But after about 30 seconds or so, there was another loud knock on the window, and it was then when Robin was just like to herself, okay, no, this could be very serious, you need to call the police immediately. And so that's exactly what she did. So officers were sent straight to the scene, and when they took a look around Robin's home, they actually told her that it did appear as though someone had been trying to break in, because the screen from her sliding glass door had been removed, and Robin hadn't done that herself, so it must have been the person that kept knocking on her window. And it wasn't long at all before the police identified who they thought the intruder might have been. You see, around this same time as officers were arriving at the apartment complex where Robin lived, there was one officer who spotted a Volkswagen car kind of driving out of the complex. So thinking that the driver of this car could have possibly been the intruder, the officer ordered the vehicle to stop and pull over. The officer got out of his car, he approached the driver, and he actually recognized him straight away. The driver was a 32-year-old man named George Waterfield Russell. He knew George because it turns out that this officer often worked as security for the Papagayos bar in Bellevue, and George Russell was actually a regular customer of Papagayos, and often when George saw this officer, he would start chatting to him, and they'd spoken enough times that they knew of each other. So anyway, back to where we were, the officer pulled George's car over, they both recognized each other, said hi, and then the officer told George why the police were there in the area. He said that they'd received a report of a possible intruder trying to break into a young woman's home and knocking on windows, and he asked George if he knew anything about that, if maybe he was the one doing it, but George denied it. He said no, it wasn't him. But regardless, the officer asked George for his driver's license, and he submitted his details for a quick background check, and what he actually discovered was that George Russell effectively was a wanted man. It turns out that there was currently a warrant out for his arrest due to the fact that he was known to have been impersonating a police officer, apparently. And according to one source, when he was pulled over, he actually had a police scanner in his vehicle, as well as a butt knife and a loaded handgun. This source actually said that George tried to hide this gun underneath his car when the officer asked him to get out. So George was arrested there at the scene, and he was taken to the police station where detectives began just looking into him a bit more, who he was. So before we carry on with the case, let me just tell you a little bit more about him, about George Russell's background. So as I mentioned before, George Russell was 32 years old at the time that this case took place. He was born in April of 1958, and he was originally from Florida. That's where he was born. His parents were called Joyce and George Waterfield Russell. George was actually named after his father, so technically he was George Waterfield Russell Jr. However, his parents split up when he was still just a baby, and it was following their separation when George and his mother Joyce moved to Mercer Island, which is a city in Washington, and she eventually married another man who became George's stepfather. Eventually, Joyce and her new husband had a child together, a baby girl, and it's been reported that whilst they completely idolized and doted on their daughter, they just kind of tolerated George. He was treated very differently to how his little sister was treated. But eventually his mother Joyce and stepfather separated also, and apparently his mother kind of kind of abandoned George after this. She moved away and he was forced to continue living with his stepfather for a while until ultimately he ended up living with and being raised by some of his aunties. And he never ever forgave his mother for this, for abandoning him. He hated her for it. In fact, it's believed that from this hatred for his mother, he just developed a hatred for all women in general. He saw all women almost as a representation of his mother and he despised them. But oddly, at the same time, he was able to charm women. As he grew older, he did catch the attention of the ladies because he was actually a very charming man. That was something that a lot of people said about George Russell. As an adult, he was very charismatic, he was friendly, he was polite, he had that kind of captivating personality and he could make conversation with anyone. But he did also have a lengthy criminal record. He got involved in criminal activity from a pretty young age. He had been arrested several times before. I think he had been in and out of jail. He had a lengthy history of theft and burglary and breaking and entering. As I said earlier, he would also pretend to be an undercover police officer, which is obviously a criminal offence. So he was someone that was known to the police. He had had brushes with the law in the past. But going back to where we were before in the case, so George Russell was obviously arrested on the evening of the 12th of September 1990 for impersonating a police officer, and I believe he was also arrested for possession of a weapon, that handgun. He was taken to the police station where detectives conducted a quick background check on him, and that was when they learned of his criminal background. Due to the fact that he had a history of breaking and entering, the police strongly suspected that he was the individual who had been trying to break into the home of that young woman, Robin Oldenburg. Obviously, he was stopped by that officer very, very soon after she contacted the police to report the intruder. He was stopped as he was literally driving out of the apartment complex where she lived. As we know, he denied having done that. He said that he wasn't the intruder, but I don't think the detectives were really convinced. And they actually started thinking, well, if he was the person who tried to break into Robin's home, is there a chance that he could also have been the East Side serial killer that they were currently hunting? Maybe if he was the serial killer, he was actually trying to break into Robin's home that night because he was looking to kill again. He was looking for his fourth murder victim. I mean, he was armed with weapons at the time, wasn't he? Remember, in his car, police discovered a butt knife and a handgun. Perhaps he planned to use these weapons during his next kill. So they just asked him in his interview, they asked George if he was responsible for the murders of Mary Ann Polreich, Carol Beath and Randy Levine. But he said no. He did say that he actually knew both Mary Ann and Randy. I believe he said that he just knew of them because he had seen them around the Bellevue nightclub scene. And one documentary that I watched about this case even said that George admitted having seen Mary Ann Polreich at the Papagayos bar on the night that she was killed. He said that he was at that same bar that evening and he saw Mary Ann there, but he denied having spoken to her and he denied murdering her, just like he denied Carol and Randy's murders. So the police asked him if he wouldn't mind providing some DNA samples so that his DNA could be compared against the DNA evidence that they had collected so far in the case. And George actually said no, he was not willing to give his DNA. In fact, it was after he was asked this question that the detectives noticed that his entire kind of presence and demeanor just completely changed. Before, in his interview, he was very calm and collected. He was polite and friendly and just being the charming guy that he usually was. But it was like as soon as he was asked for his DNA, he was suddenly on edge. He seemed very uncomfortable and he implied that there should be a lawyer present with him if the police wished to speak to him any further. Luckily, because of the arrest warrant that they already had out on him, George Russell could be detained for a period of time. The police didn't have to let him go straight away. So he was held in custody, taken to jail, whilst I think his court proceedings began for the impersonating a police officer charge. And in the meantime, the detectives investigating the East Side serial killer case were going to keep looking into him because despite their suspicions, they didn't actually actually have any evidence at all to prove that he was the murderer. So in an attempt to see if they could link him to the first victim, Mary Ann Polreich, the police once again decided to speak to, I think, all of the people that they knew had been to the Papagayos bar on the night that she was killed. This time asking them if they remembered having seen George Russell there and if at any point he was with Mary Ann. And there was one man, a security guard at the bar, that provided some very interesting information. This security guard said that he was working at Papagayos that night, and when he was shown a picture of George Russell, he remembered that he had seen him leaving the bar. However, the security guard claimed that when George left, he was not alone. He was actually accompanied by a woman that matched the description of Mary Ann Polreich. The security guard couldn't be 100% certain that it was Mary Ann that George left with, but he was pretty sure. As I said, the woman very much matched Mary Ann's description. So that was a big lead for the police. They now had a witness who had seen the main suspect in the case leaving the bar with a woman matching Mary Ann's description very shortly before she was brutally murdered. Now, something else that the police learned about George's, I guess, movements that night was that he actually went to Papagayos that evening with a guy named Smitty, who was one of his friends. So of course the police wanted to speak to this Smitty just to see if he could provide any information about George that may have been relevant to this case, and ultimately he did. It turns out that that night, whilst they were at the bar, George asked his friend Smitty if he could borrow his truck. Smitty owned this pickup truck and George wanted to use it because he had offered to give this young woman from the bar a ride home. And Smitty said yes, he gave George permission to use the truck, thinking that he would return shortly after with it. But George never did. He didn't return to the bar that night after leaving with that woman who the police believed was Mary Ann Polreich. Smitty said that he literally had to find a different way home that night, and that the day following this, George finally returned the truck. He drove it back to Smitty's house. And at the time, George said that the reason he didn't return to the bar the previous night and the reason it had taken him so long to return Smitty's truck was because the young woman from the bar that he dropped home was actually sick in the vehicle, so he had been cleaning it. However, when Smitty went into the truck, he said that there was just this overwhelming smell of blood. It didn't smell like puke in the car, it smelled like blood. So now the police are thinking that's probably the place where Mary Ann was killed. George Russell murdered her in the pickup truck that night, and then he drove her body to the back of that McDonald's restaurant in Bellevue and he left her there. With this theory in mind, the truck was seized and investigators and forensic teams literally examined every single part of it, looking for any trace of DNA evidence. And on one of the seat cushions, they discovered a stain, a red stain, which looked like blood. So this stain, this cushion, was sent off for testing, but of course back then in the early 90s, forensic testing was a very, very slow process. It would probably take weeks, even months for scientists to carry out these tests. So whilst they waited for the results from the red stain to come back, they had to just keep looking for other evidence that linked him to the crimes. They got a search warrant for George's apartment, and when they searched it, one of the things that they found was this gym bag full of pieces of paper, and on each slip of paper there seemed to be a different phone number. It turns out that these were the numbers of various different women that George had come to meet, many of which the police learned he had actually lied to and said that he was an undercover officer. This was a lie that he used a lot. Perhaps if he was the killer, he actually used this lie in his murders. Maybe he lied to Mary Ann Polreich at the bar. He told her that she had to come with him because he was a police officer, and so she did. She believed him. Anyway, he had all these phone numbers from all these different women in his home, and when the police spoke to one of these women in particular, she provided some information which would eventually lead to a breakthrough in the Randy Levine case. This woman said that she and George Russell had actually agreed to go out on a date one evening towards the end of August in 1990, around the same time that the third victim, Randy Levine, was killed. They were due to go out on this date. It was all arranged. However, George was a no-show. He stood this woman up, which of course she was not happy about. She said that the next time she saw George, he did say sorry for missing the date, and by way of an apology, he gifted her a ring, this gold ring with an amethyst stone on it. And as soon as the detectives heard about this ring and what it looked like, they realized that it matched the description of the ring that was stolen from Randy Levine. Remember, Randy always wore this same ring that her best friend gave her. She always had it on, but when her dead body was found, it was gone. It was nowhere to be found. So it seemed as though her killer had stolen it after her murder. And now the police are learning from this woman that George Russell gifted her a ring shortly after Randy's murder occurred. So the police were desperate to retrieve this ring. They wanted to see if it really was Randy's, because if it was, then that's concrete proof that George killed her. There is no other explanation for why he would have that ring. So they asked this woman if she still had it, but unfortunately she didn't. She actually said that shortly after George gave it to her, she gave it away to a friend of hers because she didn't really want it. So the police said, okay, well, can you tell us where we can find this friend that you gave it to? And she said that she didn't really know where he was. The last time she heard from him, he was about to leave Washington to travel to Florida. So now the police had to find this woman's friend, this guy that she gave the ring to find out if he still had it. And eventually, through speaking with his family, they were able to get in touch with him, and they asked him about the whereabouts of this ring. They said, can you give it to us? However, it turns out that he had given the ring away too. He said that shortly after it was given to him, he sold it to a pawn shop in Florida called Uncle Sam's because he needed some money. So following this, a police officer traveled to Florida to this pawn shop to try and retrieve it. And luckily, the owner hadn't sold it. He still had it in his possession. He'd actually separated the amethyst stone from the actual ring because I think he planned on selling the two parts separately. But he was able to give the police both pieces, and sure enough, it was eventually confirmed to have been Randy Levine's missing ring. So now the police had hard, concrete evidence connecting George Russell to her case, to the third murder. Following the discovery of the ring, the police also acquired even more evidence against George when finally scientists had completed their tests on the red stain from the truck. Scientists were able to confirm that the red stain was in fact blood, and that this blood was a match to the first victim, Mary Ann Polright. So now they had proof linking him to Mary's murder too. I've also read on a few sources that fibres found at the Mary Ann crime scene behind that restaurant where she was dumped, fibres collected from that scene matched fibres from the carpet of the truck that George borrowed from his friend Smitty on the night that Mary Ann was killed. And his DNA was also ultimately matched to the semen found on Mary Ann's body. So clearly, eventually they were able to get his DNA sample. And in addition to that, they were also able to match his hair to the hairs recovered from the Carol Beef and Randy Levine crime scene. All of this evidence proved to the police that George Russell had to be the murderer. He was the East Side serial killer, and so he was charged with all three murders. But despite the evidence against him, he still denied everything. He was adamant that he was innocent, and so he pleaded not guilty, which obviously meant that the case had to go to trial. The trial began just the year following the murders in the autumn of 1991 at the King County Courthouse in Seattle in Washington. During the trial, the defense team, so George's side, they tried to convince the jury of his innocence by claiming that he couldn't have been a serial killer because they believed that the three murders weren't even connected anyway. They claimed that because the method of killing in each case was different, because they had not all been murdered and posed in exactly the same way, that meant that they had to have been committed by separate individuals, not the same individual. According to one source I read, the defense also suggested during the trial that ex-boyfriends and ex-partners of the three women should have been looked into more. They were probably the killers because it was not George Russell. His lawyer said that George Russell was known as this charming, friendly friendly man. He was not the kind of guy that was capable of carrying out such brutal crimes. However, the prosecution obviously argued otherwise, and during the trial they presented the jury with all of the evidence that the police had obtained which linked him to each murder. The hairs, the semen evidence, the blood in the truck, Randy Levine's missing ring, the fact that he clearly tried to break into the home of Robin Oldenburg. He was trying to break into her home, probably with the intention of killing her, claiming his fourth murder victim. And as it turns out, at the end of the trial in October of 1991, the jury agreed with the prosecution and they found George Russell guilty on all 3 counts. He was convicted of the murder of Marianne, Carol and Randy. He was sentenced to 2 consecutive life sentences as well as an extra 29 years in prison without the possibility of parole, so he would never ever be released. He would be in prison until the day that he died. George Russell is still alive today. He is still in prison obviously, and he is currently around 64 years old, and as I understand it, he has never admitted his guilt. He has always denied the murders, which means that the families of his victims have never really had answers as to why he did what he did to Marianne, Carol and Randy, and exactly what the circumstances were that led to their deaths. But it's been theorized that he used his charming personality to lure his victims in, to make them feel as though they were safe around him, and then all of a sudden, when they least expected it, he attacked. And that's why, as well as being dubbed the East Side serial killer, he's also been nicknamed the Charmer serial killer, because everyone that knew George all just said the same thing. He really could come across as this charming, appealing guy. During my research of this case, I did question how exactly George got into the homes of Carol Beef and Randy Levine. Obviously they were killed in their houses where they were found. I couldn't find any information on whether he broke into their houses or if they let him in, so if anyone can provide any insight into that, please do let me know in the comments. And it's not known exactly what his motive was for these killings either, because he has never said. They were clearly in part sexually motivated, but it's also been theorized that his hatred for women motivated him to kill too. Like we talked about earlier, he hated his mother for leaving him when he was a child. He felt so abandoned by her, and it's theorized that as he went through life, as he grew older, he held a resentment towards all women because of this. He saw all women as a representation of the mother that left him, and so he wanted revenge. He took out his anger towards his mother on his victims, which is why the murders were just so incredibly violent and brutal. But that is it for this case. That is the case of the East Side serial killer George Russell. As always, please do let me know your thoughts and opinions on the case in the comments. I want to hear what you guys think, and also feel free to let me know of any other cases that you would like to see me cover on this channel. Again, you can let me know in the description box, in the comments, or alternatively, I do have a case request form linked in the description box of all of my videos. Thank you all so much for watching. Please do give this video a thumbs up and subscribe if you haven't already, and I will see you again next week for another mystery with Molly. Bye!